Hello everyone, welcome back to our video lectures. Today we're going to cover Chapter 2, Culture and Gender. All right, so understanding culture and communication, how that influences communication, we need to consider what culture is. It's the system of learned and shared symbols, language, values, and norms that distinguish one group of people from another group. People distinguish themselves between either in-groups or out-groups when we talk about culture. In-groups are the groups of people that we spend time with whom we identify. There's going to be things that we share in common with those within that group. And people in out-groups are the groups or the people in the groups that we see as different than ourselves. We tend to, spend more time with people that are part of our in-groups, but being part of an out-group can be exciting because it's something new. It gives us the opportunity to learn new things, but it can be a little bit stressful since we have to learn how to operate differently than we might normally in an in-group. There are symbols within these cultural groups, and they often vary between cultures. A symbol is going to be anything that represents an idea. So here we have an apple pie. An apple pie represents quite often being an American or freedom. You hear the phrase, as American as apple pie. So that would be a symbol. Flags and national anthems are also an example of cultural symbols. When we talk about language within culture, obviously we have many different languages at this point. Right now we have approximately 7,100 languages that are used in the world. Chinese, Spanish, and English in that order are the three most commonly spoken languages. Probably doesn't come as much of a surprise there. Values also vary within cultures. A culture's values are the standards that it uses to judge how good or desirable or how beautiful something is, and that is going to depend upon the culture as to how highly we regard something. In the US culture, we tend to value equal opportunity, material comfort, practicality and efficiency, achievement, democracy, free enterprise, and individual choice. And obviously, we look at other cultures and that won't necessarily be the same. Cultures vary in their norms, which are rules or expectations that guide people's behavior in a culture, almost like a rule. Greeting norms and norms for politeness often vary considerably across cultures. We are taught that we should smile or shake hands when we meet with someone, but that's not necessarily going to be the case across all cultures. We hear about other cultures bowing or whatnot, or the shaking of hands is frowned upon unless you are very close or comfortable with that person. Co-cultures, which are kind of a subsect of culture, are groups of people that share values, customs, and norms related to mutual interests or characteristics outside of national citizenship. So co-cultures can reflect shared activities, beliefs, or characteristics. So maybe you belong to an athlete co-culture. You play softball or basketball, and so you consider yourself an athlete, and therefore you're part of an athlete co-culture. Many people identify with multiple co-cultures. Quite often, maybe you identify with that athlete co-culture, but then you are also part of maybe an online gaming co-culture. So multiple co-cultures being an option. Many co-cultures, like that online gaming one I just mentioned, thrive online. So there's more opportunities to engage in co-cultures when you introduce the option of doing things online with people rather than having to rely on just in-person interactions. In some ways, social media platforms like Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, etc., end up making their own co-cultures. They have their own norms, symbols, etc. So for example, the symbol of a hashtag that's been generated through these social media platforms, where before that meant number, it was a number sign. They also have their own terminology. So in Twitter, there's the word tweets that means something within that co-culture, or on Facebook, we talk about likes. So we come up with new words and phrases to match that co-culture. And these also have their own norms and values. So it could be something along the lines of what can and cannot be posted or shared, things that people feel accepted to post, or how you interact with someone who has posted. If it's a friend and they post something, then you feel somewhat obligated to like or share their post, things like that. Individualistic and collectivistic cultures, that's a facet of how culture influences communication. Individualistic cultures believe their responsibility is to themselves. So they have a very strong sense of individuality, and they're quite often looking at things and framing them around how they operate themselves. Where collectivistic cultures believe their responsibility is to their community. So it's more based in family or the culture at large rather than the individual. Some traits of individualistic cultures: we see uniqueness, autonomy, independence, and self-sufficiency as being common traits. Where collectivistic cultures, we often see social rules focusing on promoting selflessness. We see them more often working as a group or doing what's best for society. And then often families and communities have a very central role within those cultures. Another facet of communication in terms of culture is low context and high context cultures. People in low context cultures are taught to communicate more directly and to say what they mean. So it's very direct and succinct, and there isn't a lot of figurative language that's used. Where people in high context cultures are taught to convey meaning through more subtle behaviors and contextual cues like nonverbal behaviors rather than verbal directness. So we see people talking but doing a lot more of that use of figurative language or talking around the issue rather than being very upfront and frank and earnest. When we look at how low context and high context cultures shake out in the specific traits within each of those, we have this this chart that we can look at. We see often low context cultures appear in the United States, England, Canada, Germany, Denmark, and Norway, where high context cultures are more often seen in Japan, China, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, France, Italy, and Spain. And you can see there's this list of different aspects and where low context and high context fall in terms of those traits. And I'll let you guys look at that in more detail rather than monopolizing more of your time listening to me speak. Low power distance and high power distance cultures is another facet of communication. People in low power distance cultures believe that no one person or group should have an excess of power. So they believe that power should be equally distributed ultimately. In high power distance cultures, certain groups do have greater amounts of power, and the average citizen has much less. And that's relatively widely accepted. It's not as challenged, and people don't have that much of a problem accepting that unequal distribution of power. Masculine and feminine cultures. So people in masculine cultures, this, this phrase is kind of, I believe, a little wonky, but we're going to roll with it. Masculine cultures cherish traditionally masculine values and believe in sex differentiated roles. So the roles of men and women are very separate, and generally people are accepting of that. Where people in feminine cultures, per se, cherish traditionally feminine values and tend not to believe in those very strongly sex differentiated roles. So this type of culture would believe in an equal distribution of power between sexes, and there's not going to be specific roles that are associated with one gender or the other. In monochronic and polychronic cultures, people in monochronic cultures view time as a finite commodity. So we in the United States are a generally monochronic culture. We look at time as valuable. We even have a phrase for it: time is money. So spending time to do something says that we value that particular thing or that particular person. Where people in polychronic cultures view time as more holistic and fluid, and it's much less structured. They don't focus so much on time. There might be more occurrences of people being tardy because time is not so emphasized. People in uncertainty avoiding cultures are drawn to the familiar and are relatively unlikely to take risks. So in these cultures, they don't value change as much. They figure, once we've found something that works, let's stick with it, because they don't necessarily embrace change as much. Where people in uncertainty accepting cultures are open to novel and new situations, and they are accepting of people and ideas that are different from their own more often. So we see more of an embracing of change and willingness to accept that change. Societies differ in their use of cultural communication codes. So a few of those types of codes include idioms. Idioms are phrases whose meaning is purely figurative. So we don't take the words for their exact translation or meaning. They instead have this figurative meaning. So a couple of examples of idioms would be once in a blue moon or head over heels. We know ultimately what that means, but we definitely don't actually mean that we are having our head over our heels. It means that we're in love or we're crazy about something. Jargon is another code. Jargon is language whose technical meaning is understood generally only by people within a co-culture. So it's a word or phrase that's specific to that co-culture. And this is especially true when we talk about specific professions. A couple examples of jargon are due diligence. So we often hear that when you're talking professionally about doing things, looking into things, being very specific about the research, or working the beat, which is something that you would hear in a journalism co-culture when they're talking about going out and reporting on certain things that happen out in the community. Gestures are another code. These are movements that express ideas. So we might give a thumbs up to say that we agree with something, or we might bow to someone in another culture to greet them. So these are just gestures that are ultimately conveying an idea rather than having to use specific words or phrases. When we talk about gender and communication, we look at gender as a function of gender roles, biological sex, and sexual orientation. It can be a combination of these. Gender roles are culturally constructed norms of how men and women are expected to act. So we look at a few different ones, specifically a masculinity role, a femininity role, or there's also androgyny. So we have certain things that we associate with those three types of roles and how we expect people to behave if they're adhering to one of those roles. When we talk about biological sex, this is affected by a few different things, including psychology. This is the sex that a person believes he or she should rightly be, something that's more, a thought or an idea that exists within our mind. Genetics, we look at simply the combination of X and Y chromosomes. What chromosomes do we have or are we born with that ultimately define our gender? And then anatomy. So anatomy, we look at the internal and external sex organs with which a person is born, and then that dictates how we would associate biological sex based on the existence of those particular anatomical organs. Sexual orientation refers to the sex or sexes to whom we are attracted. Heterosexuality, homosexuality, bisexuality, these are all phrases that we're familiar with. Asexuality may be one that we are less familiar with. This would be not necessarily being attracted to any particular sex and ultimately saying that, sexual attraction isn't a factor when we look at people. And we see sexual orientation or affiliation being a very rapidly changing topic. We hear discussions about what sexuality is or sexual orientation is, and we are constantly hearing about new classifications and people wanting to understand and respect those different orientations. So it's something to be very aware of and understand all these new and evolving ideas and accepted terminology. How gender affects communication. So oftentimes we see expressive talk or expressive communication normally being associated with women. And as part of that, communication is often seen as a primary way to establish closeness between people. Instrumental talk, which is normally associated with men, is a communication method that's seen as a means to solve problems and accomplish tasks. And it isn't so much about establishing closeness or creating bonds, so much as it is simply communicating to achieve a goal or intent. When we talk about powerful speech, powerful communication, more powerful speech is normally associated with men. And I'm going to give you the caveat that a lot of these things, it's accepted terminology or accepted ideas, but it doesn't mean that it's the absolute end all be all. There always are exceptions, but we're talking about more powerful speech being normally associated with men. And in this more powerful speech pattern, we see those particular people talking more, interrupting more frequently, and sticking to less personal topics. So they're trying to accomplish something, they have an idea in mind, and they are trying to take control of the conversation in order to get their idea across, etc. In less powerful speech that's normally associated with women, we see that person asking more questions, using hedges like, oh, it's sort of like this, or it might be the case that, or I may be wrong. So you don't sound as certain of yourself when you use these hedges. And the idea is that you aren't necessarily trying to take control of the conversation, and you're more willing to heed the control in the conversation to someone else, or make apologies or offer apologies for things that you might not be 100% right on, etc. When we talk about linguistic styles, the masculine linguistic style tends to include shorter sentences, more sentence fragments, more references to I or me, and more references to quantity. Again, probably an effort to keep the conversation to the topic at hand and get the conversation over with the intended goal achieved in a more rapid fashion. The feminine linguistic style, we often see longer sentences, more qualifiers, using ifs, buts, etc., and then more references to we and they within that communication style. So that could be an attempt to be more inclusive of everybody that's involved in the conversation, making sure to give a lot of information, hopefully, to avoid any misunderstandings, etc. In terms of touch and emotion and how those are a factor in communication, in terms of touch, among adults, we see other sex touch being more common than same-sex touch. And then in same-sex pairs, we see women touch each other more than men do. So a couple of different facets there. In terms of emotional communication, women tend to express more positive emotion, where men express more negative emotion. And again, this is not the rule, there are exceptions, but supposedly according to researchers, we see these things happen more often in terms of these gender roles. Affectionate communication. Among adults, women tend to use more affection behaviors than men do, and this difference could be due to the amount of affection that's received during childhood. Because of the masculine and feminine roles, quite often, parents bring children up differently depending on their gender. Girls are given more affection, or they're encouraged to express their feelings and emotions more, where men are taught to kind of bottle things up, be less emotional, because unfortunately the stereotype is that men should be strong and stoic and they shouldn't cry, those kinds of stereotypes. The perception kind of as stemming from this is that affection is feminine. And we can also see differences in hormones potentially promoting affectionate behavior more on the part of women. All right, so that is it for chapter 2. And please do read through your textbook because there's plenty more information. There are more examples. There are activities that you can do in the chapter to help reinforce some of these concepts. And of course, ask me if you have any questions at all, and I hope you guys have a great day. Goodbye.